I will remember to record this time. All right, so today we'll be talking about the ZEV mandates and some electricity grid policies. Again, trying to focus in on some analysis that has helped to develop some of these policies. Okay. So to start off, we'll be talking about the zero emissions vehicle rule. I think we might have kind of skirted on this subject a couple times in the past. Okay, so what is ZEV and why do we have it? So this is a regulation developed in California that is a requirement for automakers to produce zero emission vehicles. And really, I think at the end of the day, we basically have this policy to thank for a lot of the push to both produce and adopt electric vehicles. And California, I think, is really one of the big starting points for electric vehicle deployment and adoption. And a lot of other countries actually have since sort of followed suit. So the regulatory actions sort of put forth by this state, I think, has played one of the biggest roles in pushing electric vehicles, not only here, but worldwide. As a state, it's the nation's largest market for cars and light duty trucks. There's about 25 to 30 million registered vehicles, 800 million miles driven per day, and 30 million gallons of gasoline consumed per day. In California, as we'd seen before, transportation is the largest sector contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And so one of the things to note is that, okay, AB 32, we need to reduce GHGs by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. One of the motivations for this policy is that in order to reach these goals, we've talked about things like carbon taxes and cap and trade as these economically efficient instruments, right? Where we mitigate carbon in the most cost-effective pathway. And so that's one of the criticisms received by this type of policy. But part of the justification is that, okay, if I do want to reach these goals, even if you completely decarbonize transportation, so all the transport sector, zero emissions, you still wouldn't get to this, right? It requires other sectors to decarbonize as well. And so this policy is like, we might as well go all out, at least in the light duty sector, electrify everything. Okay. Any questions about that? So how does the regulation work? So ZEV credit percent requirement based on average annual sales. So let's say you sell 100,000 vehicles, and then there's a 2% credit requirement. That means the automaker has to raise 2,000 credits. And you generate credits by introducing these clean vehicle technologies. It's not completely straightforward, because when I say, a 2% credit, that doesn't mean 2% of the vehicles have to be electric vehicles. A single electric vehicle can generate more or less than one credit, depending on, well, we'll see what kind of attributes that depends on. So it's not a direct translate of like a number of electric vehicles based on the percentage. Yeah, and then spending rules based on type of vehicle that earn the credit. Okay. So who does the regulation apply to? The ZEV regulation applies to automakers that sell vehicles in California. And it's based on the number of cars they sell. These numbers and the requirements for these guys used to be a little bit different. But currently, in this time period up to 2025, you've got small volume manufacturers, intermediate volume manufacturers, and large volume manufacturers that sell this many cars per year. So less than 4,500 is small, 4,500 to 20,000 is intermediate, and larger than 20,000 is a large volume manufacturer. And these different volumes have slightly different rules, but over time, they're all going to end up sort of having to comply. And actually, we're going to look at this a little bit later, but right now, the California Air Resources Board, who is the regulatory agency responsible for this regulation, they're currently in the process of putting together the post-2025 ZEV rules. And here they're even starting to get a lot of the small volume manufacturers and really small volume manufacturers to start complying with ZEV. Yeah.
How does it deal with conglomerates? Do they just consider by the total sum of the sales?
Yeah. So trying to remember exactly. So a conglomerate, for example, would be like FCA. So you'd have like Fiat and Chrysler. And there is some kind of reporting mechanism which kind of distinguishes it. I believe it's I might be mistaken, but I believe it's the inside ones. So that like Fiat would have its own, and then Chrysler would have its own. I think that's how that works. Okay. So what do the ZEV requirements look like? So these were the targets after the midterm update in 2017. So going from 4.5% up to 22% in 2025. So we're in 2022, just passing 2021. Does anyone know what the percentage of electric vehicles were last year? Anyone care to guess? 19 to 20%.
California.
In California, yeah. So it's about 10%, maybe a little bit higher. But actually, we are far beyond compliance. So even though this says 12%, as I was mentioning, that it's based on credit amounts, and most of the EVs are producing more than one credit these days. And as a result, there is sort of a banking of credits happening. Yeah, and we can see how this will sort of increase over time. Okay. How are the credits calculated? So this was the old way, sort of pre-2017, 2016 time period. So the credits are based on the range of the vehicle. So this is the UDDS test range. So if you got 50 miles, you got 2 credits, 75 miles, 2.5, 100 miles, 3 credits, and so on and so forth. And then for fuel cell vehicles, you could get some number of credits as well, based on attributes related to range. Okay. So what do you guys think about this credit calculation method? Very generous. Okay, in the sense that like you can get a lot of credits. Yeah. So yeah. So one argument for that is kind of like it's, well, it may look generous relative to kind of the percentages, right, from these requirements. But really, you know, you kind of, you have some expectation or goal for a number of electric vehicles, which is a function of this number and the way that you structure the credits, right? So I guess you could argue this is generous if you're expecting like 5% electric vehicles, right? But that's not what they were expecting. So I think there is kind of that to keep in mind. But the other thing is that they may be sort of purposely kind of generous in the sense that, you know, it's a new technology and they want to give some more flexibility to automakers because there's uncertainty about whether they can produce them, whether people will buy them, and that sort of thing. So yeah. What do you guys think of this sort of pattern here? This is like a kind of like a stepwise function. Has anyone heard of a compliance vehicle? Okay, so a compliance car is a car that an automaker designs and sells basically strictly for the purpose of meeting some kind of regulation. So we make this argument that there are sort of commercial electric vehicles and compliance electric vehicles. And in the past decade, you can really kind of tell that there's a pretty big difference between the two. The compliance vehicles, generally automakers lose money selling them, but they do it so that they don't pay as much penalty, right? Or they can avoid the penalty associated with this regulation. And those compliance vehicles are made in low volumes. And if you look at like annual sales numbers, it's like very obvious which ones are compliance vehicles because they'll be like, they'll sell exactly 10,000 or 50,000 or something like that, right? It's the number that kind of makes it sort of nice and just in compliance. So yeah. Yes, exactly. So really the name of the game for a compliance vehicle is you make as few as possible to kind of cut your losses. So the commercial vehicles, something like a Nissan Leaf or a Chevy Volt, those were cars that the automakers were kind of producing and selling as much as they could have, as opposed to something like a Mitsubishi Miev or some of the like Ford Fusion electric vehicles, Ford Focus electric vehicles, which we kind of characterize as a compliance vehicle. Yeah, lots of them. Although these days, I would say, you know, a lot of the automakers are kind of more committing to electric vehicles, and a lot of the compliance vehicles are kind of going away in favor of sort of actual commercialization. Okay, so let me ask you, if you are an automaker and you're designing a compliance vehicle what range would you choose for a compliance vehicle? Anyone?
That also depends on the expense of like incurred per vehicle.
Sure. So would you make a, let's say, would you make a 100-mile EV? I'm just gonna, oh, okay, let me put it this way. Would you rather make a 100-mile BEV or a 150-mile BEV? And why?
Because I'm not going to get extra credits.
Yeah, exactly. So when I improve the range, essentially what you find is that I spend a lot more money on the battery. Remember, I'm losing money anyways, right? So it's kind of a bigger loss proposition. And I don't get any more credits for doing that. So if you look over the last decade, the ranges of electric vehicles were basically all 50, 75, 100, 200, right? They're doing their best to kind of do this cost savings as a result of this. And there were some kind of these, people had sort of pointed this out in some studies and doing research looking at the sort of design aspects of the vehicles and also talking to automakers. And so this is one area where you're able to sort of inject some of this scientific process to help improve the regulation. And so the new sort of current credit calculation now kind of looks like this. Okay, and so now there is this kind of incentive for vehicles to have a sort of diversity of ranges that are meant to design to cater to the use case as opposed to designing to just meet the sort of compliance requirements. And since this change, there's definitely been a much larger sort of diversity of electric vehicle ranges. Yeah, it gets a little bit more complicated down here. This is to deal with plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And it has to do with the sort of configuration of the drivetrain. And that's related to some of the emissions coming from plug-in hybrids. And so there is a minimum range here that gets cut off. You don't get anything below that. And then there are sort of two slopes having to do with the PHEV drivetrain. Yeah, so now you max out at 4 credits as opposed to before. You could get up to 7 credits, right? So the most is like 200-mile range from before, but now that takes 350. There aren't very many cars that do that that go above 350-mile range, and there is some argument to kind of disincentivize really large battery packs. Okay, any questions about that? So section 177 states, did I mention this before? Have I talked about 177 states? So this is, there's a bunch of other states that actually comply with zero emission vehicle regulation. So this actually comes from an older sort of provision. So I think we may have chatted about this during the the lecture on cafe. But the Clean Air Act, when it was passed in the 1970s, was preceded by California's Clean Air Act. And so the Supreme Court actually ruled to allow California to keep theirs. And in fact, any states that chose, all states were given an option to either comply with the federal Clean Air Act or to comply with California's, which was allowed because California's regulation was more stringent. And so a bunch of other states, so 13 other states, chose to follow California's rules. And those are known as the Section 177 states. Whenever California sort of changes the rules or has new regulation under the umbrella of the Clean Air Act, the California Clean Air Act, then states may choose to opt into those regulations, the 177 states. So these are the 177 states that chose to opt into the ZEV program. Not all of the 13 original 177 states did. What are we at now? 1, 2, 3. So 9 of them. Although other states have since kind of elected to have California style ZEV regulations. Okay, and so there's kind of this interesting thing about travel provisions for 177 states, where other states basically also have to meet those credit volume requirements. But there was something called travel provisions put into place for ZEV. And essentially what this means is that you can take credits that were earned in California and have them count as credits in other states. And the argument is that, okay, electric vehicle adoption requires, infrastructure, and maybe in other states where that infrastructure is a little bit more lacking, there's less of an expectation that the sales would do well. And so they allow the credits to travel. And the credits themselves get scaled based on, it's like a population scaling. So, if California has X million people, and then let's say Massachusetts has Y million people, the credits get scaled by Y over X. So these travel provisions expired in 2018. There was a lot of automaker pushback, still saying that essentially that there wasn't any sort of demand in a lot of these other states, and that this would be a problem for them to meet those requirements. And we actually went over and talked to a bunch of the regulatory agencies and dealerships, and found that there was actually kind of a big latent demand. And one of the ways that you can do that is you can essentially go to dealerships and look at the sort of wait times associated with people who want to buy electric vehicles. And they were months long, and people were still willing to kind of wait. And so, yeah, since the travel provisions expired, it wasn't what the automakers were saying. We saw like extremely rapid growth in a lot of those states. So there's no federal ZEV regulation yet, but the 177 states had to follow California's lead. So in addition to these guys in Oregon, Washington recently had passed a ZEV regulation, and Colorado as well. And I say not yet because President Biden actually announced an electrification target by 2030. And so I would imagine that what that would mean is that the regulatory agencies, I don't know if it's going to be the DOT or the DOE or the EPA, but likely sort of putting together some kind of regulation to push that kind of thing forward at the federal level. And that'll be sort of an interesting time as they release a rule. It'll be a good time to sort of participate in that policy process. Okay, any questions about this so far? So as the automakers generate credits, excess credits can be banked. I sort of mentioned this before. And then credits can be traded or sold to any other party. So this is kind of similar to the CAFE regulation. You can go on the CARB website and look at the trades, and it's technically you could just see who is trading credits or who is selling credits and who's buying credits and the amount. You don't get to see who is transacting with who, and you don't get to see how much the credits are being sold for. But it's kind of obvious who's trading with who because the numbers are really easy to match up with buyers and sellers because they're all, these really round numbers. One person's buying 10,000, one person's selling 10,000, one person's buying 50,000, another person's buying 50,000. So it's quite easy to kind of match that up and see who has an excess of credits and who's selling credits. You can go back and kind of figure out who's banking them based on volumes of sales. Okay, so how much is a credit worth? So let me go back to that question in just a second. So $5,000 penalty per vehicle not produced. So we consider one ZEV credit as the lowest amount of credit that can be earned by a pure electric vehicle. So one ZEV credit equals one vehicle. Therefore, there's a $5,000 penalty for each ZEV credit not produced. Yeah, and so in this case, this gives you a sense of the penalty size. So if you were buying credits, what would the ceiling for a purchase be for an automaker? Yeah, 5,000, right? Because you would not pay more than $5,000. Otherwise, it'd be more efficient just to pay the penalty. So we don't have a really good sense of the credits amounts directly, but actually there was a student here many years ago who did a sort of research project on this. So Tesla back from I would say 2010 through 2016, 2017. So Tesla in their quarterly earnings report would state how much revenue that they generated from ZEV credits. And then you could back calculate the worth of each credit by seeing the volume of credits that were traded, right? And so we know that from about 2010 through midway 2010s, credits were being sold on the market and traded to other automakers on the order of a couple $1,000s per credit. And if you remember back then, let's see, let me go back here. So my 300 mile Tesla, which earns 7 credits, if I'm selling them at $3,000 per credit, each car is earning me an additional $20,000 in extra revenue, right? That's a lot of money for an individual vehicle. And in fact, we can say with pretty good confidence that the Air Resources Board ZEV regulation is kind of what kept Tesla afloat, especially in that period of time where the sort of relative cost versus revenue that they're making in selling these vehicles was close to even if not negative. Yeah, and so I would argue that Tesla owes a lot of its success to some of the regulatory policies. Well, I mean, not to take away from from what they're doing, but the sort of presence of this policy certainly was a big boon to them. Okay. Manufacturer response to ZEV mandate. Yeah, so this was from a nice paper looking at some of the effects of the ZEV regulation and whether or not ZEV itself had a difference in basically what automakers were doing in the time period where it was kind of first implemented. So the ZEV regulation actually first started in 1990, but essentially the requirements were always a couple years down the line and not sort of being enforced. And every time it would get a little bit closer, the Air Resources Board would see that the automakers aren't making like a huge amount of progress in developing electric vehicles, so they would kind of kick the bucket down the road up until sort of the 2000 time period, where they kind of let it be known that they weren't going to do that anymore. So there's a whole sort of set of things that happened related to ZEV in that time period. Essentially what we saw was a lot more activity for patent applications related to zero emission vehicles. And again, in 2008, when the newer version of ZEV was passed, you could also see some activity here as well. And so some people were looking at whether or not the regulation itself kind of spurred this type of activity. Over time, so we kind of characterize the manufacturer response to these types of regulations as so a lot more, there's a lot more pushback from automakers when this regulation was first announced and designed in that time period. What you could expect from automakers was basically, hey, we don't want this. This is going to like ruin us, and so on and so forth. And over time, basically what happened is there are a lot more sort of proactive type of comments. So kind of more in an acceptance phase where automakers would say, okay, hey, we're okay with you doing this, but here are some things to think about, based off of constraints that the automakers may have. And so these days, you're sort of much more in this camp than in this camp. I think that everyone kind of sees the writing on the wall with respect to electric vehicles. Yeah, and so this is a nice study that was done about kind of perception of the regulation from automakers, and that can help sort of the strategery behind developments of the policy and modifications of the policy in understanding those sort of stakeholder views. Measuring emissions benefits of ZEV. Yeah, so I don't know why, but there haven't been quite as many studies looking at this compared to like the CAFE or greenhouse gas emission standards. I think one of the things that's like the Air Resources Board will kind of always point out is that the ZEV regulation is not was not designed as an emissions reduction regulation. It was designed as a technology forcing regulation. And so they were not explicitly looking at structuring the regulation and design of the regulation to decrease emissions. And if that had been the case, then the design of the policy might have been a little bit different. But kind of despite that, right, the goal of having electric vehicles has always been to help the state meet its greenhouse gas emissions target. So it's maybe not directly meant to reduce emissions, but it's motivated by a lot of those emissions-based policies. Yeah. Yeah, so this, let me see here. Oh, you're talking about this thing here? Yeah, so this should be without a ZEV mandate. Yeah, and so this model basically looks at the well-to-wheels greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see kind of the reduction by 2050 in emissions, depending on the stringency of the ZEV mandate, and then where, like if you have a mandate sort of across different states. I will say this study is probably a little bit older. The EV adoption numbers would probably be considered pretty pessimistic now. But one of the reasons why, so this is cumulative emissions reductions. And one of the reasons why this might be a little bit lower, right, is that you do have to contend with the fact that electric vehicles are even at high adoption volumes are still sort of just a portion of the fleet. It takes a long time for these vehicles to sort of turn over. As I was mentioning before, other governments have kind of turned to California to help develop their own ZEV regulations. Actually, some of the research centers and faculty and staff here were responsible for getting some of the Chinese regulators to sit down in the same room with CARB to kind of hash out details of the ZEV regulation. And it led directly to what's called the new energy vehicles program in China, which is designed based on the structure of California's. But it's substantially more aggressive, but I guess it's in some respects, it's easier for China to meet some of these requirements. We've also had sit downs with the Korean government, which has also developed a ZEV regulation kind of designed in a similar manner as California's. And there's a lot of work being done right now with the Indian government to try and get a kind of ZEV program there as well. Okay, questions? Yeah.
What do you know the effect of China's
Yeah. So China's EV regulation, frankly speaking, was kind of insane because they jumped to like a 10% from nothing, basically. Now, China actually already had some electric vehicle adoption, particularly in some of the major urban areas. The two examples that people point to are in Beijing and Shanghai, respectively, because they have these policies that basically incentivize electric vehicles because of restrictions on being able to obtain licenses. So in one case, there's kind of this auction type of mechanism. In another case, there's like a lottery type of mechanism. And so those are two ways in which you could get lucky or pay a lot of money essentially to get a vehicle license. But if you buy an electric vehicle, you're exempt from that. So that kind of really pushed big adoption of electric vehicles in those places. But they weren't at 10%. And what I can tell you is that, you know, very shortly after this regulation was passed, there was a big surge in electric vehicles sales and production. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of kind of interesting things to say about sort of the way that China sort of operates a lot of this stuff. If you're an automaker, if you're a foreign automaker and you want to sell electric vehicles or sell any vehicles in China, let's say you're GM or you're Mercedes or BMW, whatever, you actually have to have a partner company in China, like a domestic automaker. And so there are essentially these analogs of most of the popular automaking companies in China, and they get access to all the like patents and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and so I think electric vehicle development in China is going quite quickly. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and that's just that last time I was in China back in 2017, there's so many ICE vehicles. You find a single electric car.
Yeah. Well, so
this is like a big.
yeah. Well, this is like new vehicle sales, right? So it's still, you know, so it's the same thing. Like in the U.S., we have 400 million vehicles. If today every single new vehicle sold was an electric car, we sell 15 million vehicles a year. So it would take, you know, another 20, 30 years just to replace all the gas cars, right? Just based off the sort of volume of sales. So in cumulative, looking at the entire fleet, it still takes a while to kind of penetrate through. Yeah.
And actually, somebody asked me this flat out, and this might not be relevant to this, but
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, both. I mean, it'll happen kind of simultaneously. You'll see as demand for gasoline goes down, right? Then gas station owner operators, that's going to drive the prices down as demand decreases. And you can only get prices low to a certain point, right? Otherwise, you'll start losing money, and eventually, that's going to mean that they're going to go out of business. There is a lot of talk about how you might be able to I guess stay alive in the sense that you convert from a gas station to an electric vehicle charging station into a hydrogen fueling station, that sort of thing. But yeah, generally, if you have all electric vehicles, there isn't really going to be a need for gas stations anymore. Do you have a question? Uh-huh. Well, no, this is driving the surge in manufacturing, but the fact that there's these factories available certainly helps, right, with production and being able to meet these targets. Yeah.
There's also cultural differences in terms of the way that the average Chinese person drives. They don't typically go like on 300-mile road trips or whatever. Much more urban, right? Or not urban. Rural driving is not necessarily that.
Yeah, so that leads to some differences in some of the design aspects of the vehicles, for sure. There is a whole class of what's known as low-speed electric vehicles in China. They've actually since been sort of outlawed a couple of years ago. But these vehicles, you can think of them as kind of like, they actually look like, some of them, well, the nicer ones can look just straight up like a car. But you can think of them as kind of like equivalent to like a souped up golf cart. These are vehicles that have like a top speed of 40 to 50 kilometers per hour. They're a lot lighter, they're a lot cheaper, and they were sort of outselling a lot of other electric vehicles sort of at the time. But when the new energy vehicle regulations was passed, there was a question of how to sort of deal with them. And it's a tricky type of thing because regulations around these low-speed vehicles varies a lot from sort of province to province. In some places you need licenses, in some places, in most places you actually don't. So they actually ended up deciding to just ban them, or they banned them indefinitely until coming to some kind of conclusion about what to do with them. And I don't think a decision had ever been made that I'm aware of. Yeah. Okay. So as I was mentioning, yeah, right now the California Air Resources Board is updating its ZEV regulation. So it's a pretty interesting time, kind of learning about what they're doing and looking for opportunities to provide feedback and knowledge based off of existing research. And one of the things is that a lot of the regulations are a lot of them are guided by the governor and executive orders put forth by the governor. And so executive orders N7920 are helping to establish what the guidelines for the new rule are going to be. And the big driver is this guy here. You may have heard that in California, so gas cars are going to be, new gas cars are going to be banned by 2035. And so that effectively means you need 100% zero emission vehicle sales by that year. There's a couple other rules sort of regarding medium and heavy duty vehicles and even off-road equipment, which we won't get into. But those are also kind of helping with the rules formation of things like the advanced clean trucks rule. So I just pulled out a couple interesting slides from the Air Resources Board. Yeah.
Quick question about the buses and then also off-road. So if it says where feasible, are there criteria about feasibility? Like if it's going to be a certain threshold of expenses or existing capabilities?
Yeah, they basically come up with a whole set of criteria. It's actually very specific for deciding what things are feasible. Yeah. Okay. So from CARB, so manufacturers continue to comply with the ZEV regulation. This is the number of credits produced from all electric vehicles. The black line is from transitional zero emission vehicles. So this is like plug-in hybrids mainly. It used to be about 50-50 between battery electrics and plug-in hybrids up until Tesla released their Model 3 and Model Y. Now it's substantially higher for full battery electrics. And you can see the requirement for ZEVs in the sort of shaded portion. So right now there's enough credits banked out so that it's not really a problem meeting the 2025 regulation. We've generated more credits than are needed, and in fact, some of those targets we were seeing earlier, right? It was like 12% in 2022, and we're already at 10% of just vehicle sales, and each of those vehicles are producing multiple credits. So we're well above the targets. So there's this question, there's a question kind of floating around actually in years past where, hey, the ZEV regulation kind of did its job. We don't really necessarily need it anymore because manufacturers are producing enough electric vehicles. They're exceeding the requirements. And so there isn't really a need to have the requirements in the first place. But then with the new executive order, it means that future adoption probably needs to be really quite aggressive. Yeah, and so thinking about how to meet those requirements is going to look pretty aggressive post. So this is what we're talking about, getting up to 2025, and then going sort of beyond that looks something like this, right? And so yeah, how do we end up getting to 100% by 2035? And so there are a couple sort of different trajectories that people are looking at. Yeah, and you know, you can really get into a lot of the nuances here, thinking about like adoption curves, thinking about costs of compliance, a lot of the issues we've been talking about in this course already, leading to kind of the formation of these numbers. Yeah.
Just for like,
Yeah, this is just for light duty. Yep. So passenger cars and light duty trucks. There is a lot of discussion about the role of plug-in hybrids. So these two findings were really kind of important. Actually, a lot of the research is coming out of the Institute of Transportation Studies here at Davis, where we're looking at, for a plug-in hybrid where you're both on electric and gas, how much of the driving is being done on electric, how much is it being done on gas. That helps inform the regulatory agency in how to kind of allocate and distribute credits. So thinking about some of the things that they were discovering is that it's sort of highly consumer dependent and also vehicle dependent. The range of the vehicle matters a lot when it comes to how many electric miles are being used. And then real world emissions can be higher than shown on test cycles. One of the big things has to do with cold starts. So if you are driving in a gas car, when you turn on the engine and you kind of drive away, your engine heats up as you kind of get up to speed, right? It takes some time for the engine to get into sort of higher speed operation. And by the time that happens, right, the sort of combustion cycle in the drivetrain has sort of ramped up from 0 speed. But if you're in a plug-in hybrid and you're driving on the freeway and you turn the engine on, your engine is all of a sudden operating from a sort of cold temperature at sort of high operation. And that can lead to like 10 times higher emissions for a single trip. And so there are issues like these that they're thinking about here. Thinking about consumer choice and model diversity. So a lot of the early adopters for electric vehicles might be sort of enthusiasts of this, easier to kind of get to purchase an electric vehicle, but sort of at the end of the curve, you have, I guess, what we call holdouts. So people who don't want to buy an electric vehicle, some for preference reasons, maybe some for sort of legitimate operational reasons. And for those, you might need like a plug-in hybrid for people who are driving, hundreds of miles a day. Yeah, and so there are a whole sort of slew of issues related to plug-in hybrids that CARB is thinking about, and a lot of that, a lot of those issues, and then some of these direct input issues, sort of regarding plug-in hybrids, I think are going to be really important to the sort of design of the upcoming regulation. And so there's a lot of research and modeling opportunities to look at some of these questions and other questions happening right now regarding the ZEV regulation. So yeah, still kind of an exciting time regarding the ZEV mandates, and a lot of sort of potential opportunities right now. Yeah, I should mention this one, number 2. So yes, ever since kind of the updates to cap and trade and LCFS in 2017, the California legislature and regulatory agencies have begun putting a lot of sort of emphasis on issues related to environmental justice and equity. And I think there hasn't been so much of that in the previous ZEV regulations, but they're kind of explicitly trying to think about this now, especially as you get sort of more mainstream electric vehicles. You know, we don't want these kind of policies just subsidizing sort of wealthier income folks to get electric vehicles. You really want this to be sort of accessible to everyone. And if you do have something like by 2035, everyone has to buy an electric vehicle, are you putting unnecessary burden on lower income families, forcing them to buy this kind of new technology? And so how can we kind of deal with that issue? Okay. Any questions about this? Or comments? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so you're not asking me like me personally. No. So in general, yeah, so there is, so research funds, yeah, I would say there isn't as, I mean, there definitely is, but not as much, I would say, for like technological development. Yeah, like when you're talking about actual like engineering and that sort of thing. And when they do, it's usually related to development of things that are sort of specifically targeted pieces of regulation. So for example, like this is all ZEV, the ZEV rules fall under what's known a sort of broader category of regulation known as the Advanced Clean Cars rule. And they have these like low pollutant emission requirements. And so there's funding related to mechanisms that can sort of measure that help to either measure or decrease like pollutant emissions. One big thing was like the development of standardization of the onboard diagnostics port that allows them to do readings of emissions and combustions from the drivetrain of gas cars. So there is some of that, but I would say a lot of what we do is more sort of on the policy end of things. And then, so I see a question over there somewhere. No. Yes.
So I just want to ask, or I'm kind of curious, you mentioned that TTP is more concerned by lower income consumers.
It can't, it could be. I think there was, yeah, so plug-in hybrids may remain an important choice among lower income consumers. So one of the ways that they got to that conclusion is that there's this Clean Cars for All program, which is a, if you've heard of something like a cash for clunkers, where you take an old car, you trade it in for a new car, and you get like a bigger incentive. Yeah, exactly. And most people there were definitely a lot more people taking advantage of that to get plug-in hybrids compared to battery electric vehicles. And that was a program that was available to like lower income communities. Yeah. So you might think that because it has to have both, right? But they're pretty good at making the engines already. And if the biggest portion of the cost comes from the battery. Plug-in hybrids have smaller batteries, so it's actually easier for them to make or cheaper for them to make. Yeah, does that? Are you still wondering something?
No, I just feel like it's more expensive, because it is still more expensive than internal combustion.
Oh, yeah.
But then when a battery technology advances, it will also lower the price for battery electric vehicles.
Yes. So yeah, it'll be more expensive than a gas car, but generally is still cheaper than battery electrics because of the battery size. But
I'm just like more considering what is exactly the most strong incentive to choose HEV amount internal combustion HEV and also battery electric.
oh, well, if you want an electric vehicle, but then you also don't want to deal with their like range limitations, I think is the big thing that people usually, yeah, it's a preference thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Cost is the primary driver. Like I was reading some people say DEV just to purchase by high production.
Yes.
So the combination of driving still lies with the PhD or low income.
Yeah.
Vehicle with 25 mileage or electric. After that, if you want to travel, you can just switch to the active.
Yeah.
For a 300-mile range vehicle, DEV is more expensive. So this time the reason why vehicles are still popular with the medium income.
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of all these things. I think there's still kind of range anxiety and uncertainty, availability of charging infrastructure, that kind of drives people to still buy plug-in hybrids, and the fact that they're still cheaper. And I think, okay, relative to gas cars, yeah, they're more expensive, but then if you have all the incentives, they can be as competitive. So. Okay. So we'll leave the topic of ZEV regulation kind of with these open-ended questions. And we'll move on to talk about some electric grid stuff. Clean power plan. Actually, who's heard of the clean power plan? Anyone? A couple people. Yep. Unfortunately now defunct. Oh yeah, did you have a question? No, okay. So this was proposed by the EPA back in June of 2014, with the final plan sort of unveiled by President Obama in August of 2015. And so this went through the whole regulatory process, which I think we're all kind of familiar with now, right? So publication of the initial rule, open comment period, and then publication of the final rule. So final version, plan to reduce CO2 emissions from electricity power generation by 32% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels, with a big focus on reducing emissions from coal power plants, increasing renewable energy, and then a big one, improving energy efficiency and conservation efforts. Yeah.
Do you know how they go about picking what levels? Like I know in California there are a lot of reduced by 90 emission levels.
Well, the baseline is just, I think, kind of, I don't want to say arbitrary, but it's kind of arbitrary. Like it's all based off of, it's just a set number that you can compare to. The 32% is probably the big thing that's important. And what they're going to look at there, right, through a lot of the systems modeling and feasibility, is, how how you can get to this target and whether or not the sort of technology is capable of doing that, whether the cost associated with that kind of transition is kind of feasible for companies and stakeholders to undergo. And so there's a good bit of I think you know, to some extent there's some modeling, but a lot of this is also going to be driven by, you know, feedback from the public, from real stakeholders about getting to any particular number. So it's somewhat made up and arbitrary to some degree, right? But there is a lot of backing for sort of feasibility that goes into this. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. They assumed these like pretty, like one of the ways they got to this 32% was making some fairly, let's say, aggressive energy efficiency assumptions, where, you know, the reduction in baseload demand for electricity would decrease by some percent every year, which I think a lot of people kind of looked at and were like, that is fairly unrealistic. But then when people think about this 32% number, I think like there's still a lot of sort of positive feedback there because, you know, you want to be kind of aggressive as possible. So this number, yeah, again, driven by some of the, you know, more robust like technology modeling type of things, but also somewhat political as well. Okay, and actually, sort of right around this time period, this was kind of back when I was sort of ending grad school. A lot of my colleagues who were more in the electricity side of things were doing all sorts of like modeling, looking at things like we've talked about how a merit order, and so how that could change in order to meet some of the requirements. Actually, this particular work was done by Bushnell, you know, right here at Davis, thinking about what it would mean to be able to meet some of those caps and sort of how power plants would operate differently. Thinking about modelings about expectations of emissions rates from coal power plants sort of decreasing over time in order to meet regulations. And so effectively what the clean power plant would do would either require coal power plants to tremendously improve efficiency, to employ carbon capture, or basically to retire. So we could actually look sort of state by state. Again, a lot of this, there's a whole bunch of modeling that goes behind sort of the calculation of a lot of these numbers. But essentially what you can see is sort of across the board, all across the country, state by state, there's going to be pretty dramatic reductions in emissions. Okay, and so yeah, I won't get too much into some of the nuances and details of the policy, about like options that states would have to comply, because so clean power plan is no longer around. Back in June of 2017, Donald Trump announced a total withdrawal from the Paris agreements, which allowed, so I'll say that the CPP, its original, the original instantiation of CPP was basically one of the ways that the US could meet its Paris Agreement obligations. And by backing out of the Paris agreements, it provided more impetus to kind of roll back the Clean Power Plan, which eventually happened in October of 2017. Yeah, so Scott Pruitt, who was the first EPA administrator under President Trump, he ended up formally repealing CPP, which is the Clean Power Plan. And then in May of 2019, EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, who was the kind of last EPA administrator under Trump, announced plans to replace the Clean Power Plan with what's known as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, ACE. And the whole idea was to recalculate how EPA measures health risks of air pollution and calibrating it to be sort of less impactful. So it would lower health-related deaths. It would enable companies and corporations essentially to pollute more. So big blow to a lot of the really, I think so. So I will say that kind of as a reference point, the Clean Power Plan is one of the most aggressive electricity policies in the recent past to really sort of clean up electricity generation in the US. And unfortunately, yeah, so this was a big regulation heralded by a lot of environmentalists and that sort of thing. And this is kind of like a complete turnaround of the CPP. So fortunately, last year, right after Biden was elected, the federal DC court, circuit courts ruled that ACE violated the Clean Air Act. So I should kind of back up for a second and just mention that there's a whole lot of there are a whole lot of lawsuits happening at this time. So actually, even as CPP came out, a whole bunch of states sued the EPA. You know, obviously, there are some states that are going to stand to lose more, especially sort of coal-heavy production states. And then when it was repealed, a whole bunch of states sued that as well, because, right, we want to maintain a clean environment and be able to have this type of policy. But basically what ended up happening is that the DC Circuit ruled that ACE violated the Clean Air Act. So this was not allowed to happen. And this kind of opens the door for our current president to make a new rule from scratch. So actually in December, just 2 months ago, President Biden signed the Catalyzing Clean Energy Industries and Jobs Through Federal Sustainability Executive Order, so 14057. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff here related to that. So 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2030. That's like a huge departure from even CPP, right? So CPP was 30% reduction. This is saying 100% carbon-free. And then there's a whole bunch of other things. Okay, notably, right, 100% zero emission vehicle acquisitions by 2035. So that's for the federal governments. So some similar to kind of ZEV regulations, but it's going to be specifically for fleet vehicles. Yeah, and so as the president kind of puts out these executive orders, it means that the regulatory agencies are likely going to be sort of producing regulation to support these each of these orders in the near future. And so similar to the CPP process, I think we're going to really soon going to be seeing rules that are going to be helping sort of each of these bullet points come to fruition. So again, a lot of opportunity for scientists and even the general public to kind of weigh in and provide feedback on the sort of legitimacy of these and how you might go about doing these, sort of any level of feedback. Yeah.
It's kind of like realistic, especially for 2030.
I don't know. Good question. I mean, it's definitely, I can tell you it's definitely gonna be hard. It's definitely gonna be expensive. But on the other hand, like this is the measure of things that might need to happen, right, to deal with some of the climate change issues that scientists have been talking about for quite a long time. Yeah, and you know, maybe, you know, without kind of speaking to necessarily to the feasibility of doing this, but you know, unfortunately, we kind of twiddled our thumbs a lot when Trump was in office, and so you know, it gets harder and harder to do this with the shorter and shorter time frame. But I think this type of thing is necessary. Any other questions or comments or thoughts about this? Okay. The last thing we'll talk about today is actually somewhat related to this, is the renewable portfolio standards. So kind of as an aside from the sort of direct decarbonization efforts that the federal government is putting forth, actually one of the oldest rules for development of renewables on the grid since kind of the early 2000s is known as the renewable portfolio standards. And you can kind of think of this like a ZEV rule for the electricity grid, essentially where it's a regulatory requirement that increases production of electricity and energy from renewable energy sources. So also known as RES, the Renewable Electricity Standards. It's pretty simple. It just means that, so if you're an electricity supply company, you must produce a specified fraction of electricity from renewables, and you can track this by the electricity that utilities purchase. So wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, but actually does not typically include hydropower. So any of these renewable sources will count towards that fraction. And so again, this preceded basically most of the sort of climate regulations that we've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years. So in California, it's first established through Senate Bill 1078 in 2002. And one of the interesting things you can see, okay, so 20%, so the first one says 20% by 2017. And essentially, California has been able to meet and exceed its target basically all the time. And so as new requirements came out, we could see they got sort of more and more stringent. So in 2006, SB 107 basically said, okay, 20% by 2010, we pushed the timeline up 7 years. And that's because of kind of the trajectory and growth in renewables that we were seeing. SB2 kind of pushed out longer. So in 2011, 33% has to be renewable by 2020. In 2015, we passed SB 350, which says half of electricity must be renewable by 2030. We again continue to pass a lot of the trajectory targets, and as a result, SB 100, which I believe is the most recent modification of the RPS requirements, unless someone else knows. So this was passed in 2018, so 60% by 2030, and all electricity has to be carbon-free by 2045. Yeah, so this may give, so we think this is fairly reasonable. And I do think that in California it's probably a little bit easier, simply due to the availability of solar power, right? That we looked at earlier on in the course, we looked at the solar installation, right? There's a lot more in the Southwest than in other parts of the country. So electricity must be carbon-free by 2045. Now, you know, we're thinking about that target for 2030 at the federal level. So this is all going to get presumably accelerated. So in California, we can see what how our generation has changed over time. So this is just from renewables. So end of 2018, we are up to almost 100,000 gigawatt hours, 100 terawatt hours. As a reference point, the total generation in California is around 200. So at 50% already. But a lot of this is you can have things like behind the meter storage, which might be a little bit different. Hang on, is that right? 50%? That seems too high. Well, it is 100,000 gigawatt hours. So, well, not entirely sure if it's 50%, but what I will say is that I do know that we're sort of consistently ahead of the target. So we're definitely higher than 33%, which was the target for 2020. The regulation has directly led to proliferation of renewable generation facilities in California. You can kind of see this breakdown map here of different sorts of installations. Blue is your small hydro, red are your large wind farms. Yeah, and if you guys have never been to a large wind farm, I highly encourage taking a tour at some point. It's pretty interesting. And then you've got a lot of solar photovoltaic, which is in yellow. Some concentrated solar thermal power plants sort of out in the desert. And as mentioned, California is on track to exceed its targets. California is not the only state with RPS requirements. In fact, many other states, and actually some other states actually have even preceded California. But we can see that there are a lot of states all across the country that have RPS requirements. Texas notably has some of the highest renewables in the country due to the prevalence of wind power and wind turbine installation there. Yeah, and then again, kind of looking at some of the modeling that can help unpack some of the impacts related to RPS. This one's actually fairly straightforward, basically looking at, so okay, renewable energy generation, comparing states that have an RPS versus states that don't have RPS, and sort of unsurprisingly, right, the percentage of generation, particularly in the sort of recent past, with states that have RPS in the dotted line versus states that don't. One thing though is that a lot of the renewable generation is more expensive, and so you will also see that electricity prices reflect that. So the average electricity prices in states with RPS is definitely higher than in states without RPS. CO2 emissions are going to be lower, obviously. So here we can see the sort of difference between emissions rates for states that have a lot of renewables versus states that don't. And then electricity demand is going to be slightly different. Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of these plots here. They don't start at 0, so it's a little bit deceptive, but still gives you some relative anchoring for the position of these things. Obviously, we care a lot about renewables in reference to their emissions impacts, and so you can actually see not only from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, but a lot of renewables are offsetting natural gas plants, coal plants, the combustion of which leads to local air pollutants. And so I can actually even go and measure reduced health and environmental damages thanks to RPS in different places, right? And we monetize this based off things like the morbidity and mortality that we had talked about before, you know, this value of statistical life, right? That we say is maybe a little bit controversial, but allows us to quantify air pollution damages in this way. Okay, and besides the US, this is actually a fairly relatively popular policy across the world. There's an alternative type of mechanism to promote renewables called feed-in tariffs, which we won't really talk about, but we can see that through the combination of RPS and feed-in tariffs that covers quite a wide range of different countries across the world to help increase the portfolio of renewable power. Still a lot of challenges for this type of policy. So there's a lot more complexity for assessing compliance. So procurements, especially as it comes to sort of, okay, let's talk about like distributed energy assets. So like rooftop solar type of things. It can be difficult to procure all of that information, especially when you have net metering. where you have to then estimate essentially how much demand there would be without the solar, like a rooftop solar unit. Pushing RPS may cause an issue with kind of stranded assets, right? You're going to be decommissioning power plants, natural gas plants or coal plants, which may not have sort of gone to the end of its life. And so there's also kind of waste issues associated with that, as well as with the renewable systems. It's a lot of like solar arrays are lasting 20, 25 years. Right now we're getting to that time point when the original RPS was formulated in 2002. That was 20 years ago now. And so waste issues related to retirement of these renewables. Yeah, the sort of really big one is integration and curtailment. So the electricity grid has to produce electricity at the same time that we use it, right? But then solar and wind power are intermittent, right? You're not going to get any solar energy at nighttime, but people will still be using electricity at that time. When you have a smaller percentage of renewables, it's less of a problem because you have all these other sort of power plants that can make up that energy when you need it. But as you get to higher and higher levels, 60, 70, 80% renewables, now what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with that? So yeah, you could have something like a storage device, right? But then if you need storage coupled with your solar power, that increases the costs pretty dramatically, right? And we saw that RPS states are already paying kind of the most or more for electricity than states without them. So still lots of big challenges, I think, coming up for sort of higher penetration of renewables as a result of this policy. Okay. Any questions about RPS? All right, well, so that's all I have for today. So we'll end here. And I will just quickly mention, yes, I'll actually be coming up with a randomized presentation order for projects next class so that you can see what day that you'll be presenting. Now is the time that you guys should really start honing in and working on the project. I will provide feedback from all the proposals by the end of the day, either today or tomorrow. So hopefully you guys will be able to start working off some of that feedback. The last homework has also been posted. I think you guys will find this homework is a lot easier than previous homeworks. It's just it's a big systems model that exists online on an online platform that you guys can go into and kind of play around with. And so they're just little things to look at in the homework to help kind of adjust how you play with the model. But yeah, there won't be any sort of math or anything on the last homework. Okay, great. Let me end our recording.